Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you for joining us here today at this virtual side event of the High Level Political Forum of 2022. Today's session is titled "The Political Effects of the SDGs since 2015, Findings from the Global SDG Impact Assessment." And before we start, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Melanie van Driel. I'm a PhD researcher of the Global Goals Project and also a board member of the United Nations Association of the Netherlands. And over the next 1.5 hours, we will be discussing the findings of the SDG Impact Assessment. The SDG Impact Assessment is the first meta-analysis of the available scientific knowledge about the steering effects of the SDGs since their inception in 2015. 61 researchers participated in the assessment, and it will be released in full later this month. And the assessment itself comes, of course, at an important juncture for global sustainability governance. We are currently halfway through Agenda 2030, and we need to know earlier rather than later if our main mechanisms to secure sustainable development are functioning as needed. So this year and next year at the HLPF, we must take stock on what we have achieved with and for the SDGs so far. And to discuss the findings, we have invited a group of excellent international experts to discuss the assessment and the state of the SDGs so far. And before we start, I will introduce these panelists one by one in alphabetical order. So let me start on the left with Dr. Marianne Beisheim, who is a senior researcher at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Her research expertise is in global governance for sustainable development with a focus on negotiations and institutions at the United Nations. Specifically, she has extensively researched the HLPF itself. Next, Professor Dr. Frank Bierman, who is research professor of global sustainability at Utrecht University with the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. He is director of the Global Goals Project, a research program funded by the European Research Council that studies the impact of the SDGs, and he has been the co-convener of the International SDG Impact Assessment. Then Professor Pamela Chasek, who is chair of the Political Science Department at Manhattan College, where she also advises the Model UN team. She's co-founder and executive editor of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, a long-standing reporting service on United Nations environment and development negotiations. Next, we have Professor Louis Coetzee, who is research professor of law at the Faculty of Law, Northwest University, South Africa, and senior professional fellow in Earth System Law at the University of Lincoln in the United Kingdom. And he has also been a lead author of the SDG Impact Assessment. Then we have Andrea Ordóñez, who is the director of Southern Voice, and she recently co-edited the book Southern Perspectives on the Post-2050 International Development Agenda with Debapriya Bhattacharya. And Sandra Pellegrom, who is the Dutch National SDG coordinator, working with the government, but also with different stakeholders for the implementation of the SDGs in the Netherlands. Before her role as SDG coordinator, she was head of the Department on Development, Humanitarian and Human Rights at the Permanent Mission of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to the UN. And last but not least, we have Jorge Valderrabano, an expert in international relations and social work, who co-founded Agora Mexico, an organization promoting political engagement among young people, and is currently the regional coordinator for America at the United Nations, United Networks of Young Peace Builders. And he is also today speaking on behalf of the United Major Group on Children and Youth. So thanks all of our panelists for being here today. The program today will be as follows. I will hereafter give Frank and Louis the floor to present the main findings of the SDG Impact Assessment, and thereafter I will invite our distinguished panelists and ask them for their insights and reflections. And then we will have space for questions from the audience. And in terms of housekeeping, you will have noticed that only the video and audio of the speakers, panelists, and the moderators are enabled, but you can use the chat for any questions you might want to ask. And these questions will be discussed as much as possible after the roundtable. So please use the chat function of this webinar if you have any questions. And without further ado, I will now give the floor to Frank Bierman and Louis Coetzee.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie, for the introduction. Good morning, everybody in New York. Good afternoon, good evening, if you are in different time zones. I think it is known for everyone in our community that 2022 is a very, very important year. It's a year in which we are marking 50 years after the Stockholm Conference. It's 30 years after the first Rio Conference. It is 10 years after the last Rio Conference. It's an important event by which we also have to look back at the history of political programs and goals that we had in these 50 years, international agreements, goals, and programs that have been concluded for so many years. And one of these most important goal-setting efforts of the last period has been the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals that we are discussing today. Next slide, please. So the SDGs are the main framework, normative framework that the United Nations have agreed for the current period. They were agreed in 2015. They are to be achieved largely by 2030. We are exactly half time. These goals are marked by 4 key characteristics. Number 1, they are not legally binding, unlike many of the treaty regimes that we have. Many of the 969 targets that are under the SDGs are qualitative. That means also they are quite difficult to assess. The SDGs are, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, are integrated in a way that they cover the global north and the global south. So all countries are committed to these SDGs and are supposed to achieve the SDGs till 2030. And they are extremely broad in the areas that they are addressing. Essentially, all kinds of human activities are covered by the SDGs. And this makes them an extremely challenging and extremely important, but also an extremely demanding agenda. So now, 2022, next slide, please. It is time for us as the research community, those who are working on sustainability for many years, to assess whether the SDGs actually had any political effect. So the effectiveness so far is technically unknown. They have been operational now for 7 years, but we are lacking so far comprehensive meta studies that are analyzing whether this goal-setting effort from 2015 had actually any impact on the politics at the local level, at the national level, at the global level, in the public sector, but also in the private sector. So is anything different because we have agreed in 2015 on the SDGs? This is a very, very important political question for governments, for the United Nations, for any local actor, but also for everybody, for every citizen in a way who is engaged in the quest for global sustainability. And 2022 is exactly the right moment to start a midterm assessment, to start a discussion. What did we learn over the last 7 years about whether SDGs work as a governance mechanism, and also to discuss the future of the SDGs after 2022. So what, if we have any conclusions on the SDGs, what can we do better in the next years till 2020, but also 2030, but also what is the best way forward after 2030? Is it maybe a way for continuing with a goal-setting approach such as the SDGs, or are maybe totally different approaches in global sustainability governance necessary? Next slide. To address this question, we have organized in the last 2 years the SDG Impact Assessment. It is now being published in an article that came out 2 weeks ago in Nature Sustainability, and a book that will come out next month, at the end of this month, with Cambridge University Press. Next slide. This has been a process that brought together 61 authors from different countries. All continents have been involved, different levels of seniority, all authors that have been engaged in sustainability research for many, many years. And together, we assessed more than 3,000 articles that we identified through our literature research on Scopus, articles that were in some way discussing the SDGs, related to national level, local level, or global level politics. And then we have looked at 10 or 20%, depending on the issue area, of these articles in more detail, because many of these articles were not that relevant actually to studying the political impact. So only 10 to 20% of these articles were really on target, were really discussing the political impact of SDGs. And those 10 to 20% we looked at more detail, we read them extremely carefully. We added also in certain areas gray literature that we were familiar with, partially also the own assessment of our colleagues, the 61 co-authors. And we looked in particular in 3 questions. So we were not that much concerned directly with the achievement of the SDGs per se. We were concerned with the political impact of the SDGs over the last 7 years on 3 areas. And the first area was we wanted to know whether the SDGs had any normative steering effects. We wanted to know whether any country or any United Nations agency or any local government mechanism has changed the rules, the policies, the programs, any normative systems because of the SDGs. So has anything changed in a country because the SDGs have been agreed? Number 2, we were interested in the institutional steering effects. We wanted to know whether any country or any UN agency or any local institution has been changed, differently arranged because of the SDGs. That was our second most important question. And the third question was, we wanted to know whether the SDGs had any discursive effects. We wanted to know whether the SDGs have helped to change the way how actors understand sustainability, has the way how sustainability is defined, how it is being understood by actors. Has it changed in any way because of the SDGs? And of course, we believe that discursive changes are very important also to lead eventually to changes of the institutions and to changes of the normative framework. So these were the 3 core questions that we assessed. These were the 3 core questions we wanted to understand by looking at all these hundreds of articles that we analyzed in the SDG Impact Assessment over the last 2 years, in teams of 61 authors in total. Next slide, please. We organized this work in 6 working groups. So we looked at these 3 questions that I just outlined at the level of global governance. So we were very interested whether anything has changed at the level of international institutions, international organization, the UN system, also including the high-level political forum. We wanted to know whether any change has happened at that level. Number 2, we were very interested when anything has changed at the local and national level, particularly the level of governments. Does any government change its structures, its institutions, its norms because of the SDGs? And then certainly we were interested in the question whether the SDGs have led to a stronger integration and an increase in policy coherence over the last 7 years, because this is one of the big claims of the SDGs, is to reduce the fragmentation that we experienced over the last decades in sustainability governance. So the question is, did the SDGs actually manage to integrate and to provide stronger coherence in sustainability governance at the global, national, and local level over the last 7 years. This was our third main research area. And the fourth was taking up the claim of the SDGs that nobody is left behind and that inclusiveness should be a central characteristic, a central element, equity, justice, and inclusiveness, central elements of sustainability governance as we move forward. And we want to know whether anything has changed in this particular area over the last 7 years. At the national level, at the local level, but also at the international level, has anything changed in terms of justice, equity, and inclusiveness over the last 7 years? The sixth area we were interested in is the question to what extent the SDGs managed to, at the same time, advance social justice and other economic and social values, but also protecting the basis of our sustainability, the planetary system, the environmental systems of our planet. To what extent did the SDGs really help to protect the planet, to protect the planetary boundaries in a very critical moment, of planetary crisis? Did the SDGs help to really protect the key planetary systems and advance the protection of these systems over the last 7 years? And can we report any progress on that level because the United Nations agreed 7 years ago on the SDGs? This was the sixth area we were looking at, the area of planetary integrity. And finally, we were a social scientist and also natural scientists working together with us. We were interested also in the methodological area. And how can we really understand the SDGs from a scientific perspective? How can we study them? How can we bring together large research programs that are based on modeling, on quantitative research activities, together with more qualitative research at the local level, at the country level? So we're very interested also to advance the toolbox of the analyst and to bring this forward and to develop, maybe also assess existing methods, but maybe also developing new methods. So these were the 6 areas that how we organized our work among 61 authors together. And my colleague Louis Coetzee will now report. Oh no, the next slide, please. It's still for me, sorry. The next slide is just the overarching finding, before Louis will go into much more detail. That the overarching finding is that we had identified only very limited political effects so far. I mean, this is one of the key conclusions that we have. We identified in all these areas some discursive effects. So actors are talking differently about sustainability, so the SDGs are mentioned. And we also found some normative institutional reforms in different countries, also at the UN level to some extent. Learning is clearly identifiable among countries. Especially at the local level, we found lots of positive change in certain local communities at the level of cities. NGOs, civil society are picking up the SDGs and moving forward and using the SDGs also to hold governments and other actors accountable. On the other hand, if we take the entire challenge of sustainability, the entire challenge of the planetary crisis that we are facing, then, and the claims of the agenda, the claims of the United Nations General Assembly, and the claims of all governments united in 2015 when they agreed on the SDGs, talking about transformation, talking about bold action, talking about changing the world and the planet, then we must confess that, and we must conclude that we cannot conclude that the SDGs had a major transformative impact by themselves on local, national, and global governance. So overall, our finding is pretty sober, and we could not find any major transformative impact in the last 7 years because of the SDGs. And this leads, of course, to a discussion of the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Can we expect more change in the next 7-8 years? Or is it rather a negative conclusion and we need maybe a different approach? And this will lead later for discussion. But first, I would invite Louis to report then on the more detailed findings of our assessment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Good day, everyone. I'm very happy to present in a very brief form some of the main findings of our study. So in terms of the impact on global governance, more specifically, we have found that study suggests that while the governance principles that underpin the SDGs, such as universality, coherence, integration, and certainly also the core principle of leaving no one behind, have become part of the mainstream discourses in many multilateral institutions and global governance fora. Actual reforms in the operations of these organizations and institutions since 2015 have been modest. And there is no real strong evidence that would suggest that the SDGs have had a significant transformative impact on the mandates, the practices, and certainly also the resource allocation of the international organizations and institutions within the United Nations system. Perhaps particularly relevant, certainly for today, is that studies also suggest that the high-level political forum on sustainable development has not really lived up to expectations of becoming an effective orchestrator of sorts in global sustainability governance. There are some positive signs, certainly, of voluntary national review processes that has helped to disseminate best practices across countries with respect to implementation. But evidence suggests that the forum has not really provided the type of political leadership and effective guidance for achieving the SDGs. And it has failed in the main to promote system-wide coherence, largely because of its broad and unclear mandate, combined with the lack of resources and, as one could expect, because of divergent national interests. Next slide, please. So the impact on domestic politics, we found some evidence that state and certainly non-state actors, more specifically, have started to implement the SDGs at the national and local levels. And many countries have also begun to integrate the SDGs into their governance and broader administrative systems. While several governments have designated bodies specifically concerned with the SDG governance and new units that aim to implement these goals. Yet, the performance of national governments vary widely, and most countries lag behind in implementing the SDGs. So observable institutional change often merely replicates existing priorities, trajectories, and government agendas. And governments, again, in the main, tend to selectively implement those SDGs that actually support the policies that they've already prioritized. Next slide, please. The impact of the SDGs on institutional integration and policy coherence. In this respect, we found that several governments have taken deliberate steps, very encouraging ones, to align their institutions towards the SDGs. Some countries, for example, such as the Netherlands, have established coordinating bodies within central agencies, and others, such as Germany, have promoted interministerial exchanges to bring their public administrative systems in line with the SDGs. But again, these attempts differ from country to country, leading to very large variations in institutional SDG-inspired integration. So overall, our finding is that governments still fall short of enhancing policy coherence to implement the SDGs, despite modest advances in some countries. Where we see evidence of integrating SDGs into national strategies and action plans, this has not yet led to new or adjusted cross-sectoral policies and programs that actually cohere with one another. And experts also seem to be divided in their expectations as to whether stronger policy coherence for the SDGs will actually emerge before 2030. Next slide, please. the impact on inclusiveness. The 2030 Agenda certainly is meant to address inequalities within and among countries and to ensure that no one is left behind. A point that Frank has highlighted also in his discussion. Vulnerable groups and countries are, as we know, extensively mentioned and referenced in the 2030 Agenda and in several specific SDGs and their targets. In addition, 2 SDGs are specifically dedicated to the reduction of inequality within and between countries, Goal 10, and the promotion of equality for women and girls, Goal 5. However, evidence suggests a mismatch between rhetoric and action. On the one hand, vulnerable people and countries are often discursively prioritized in the implementation of the SDGs. So there's a lot of rhetoric, but little action. And this is evidenced by the broad uptake, for example, of the principle of leaving no one behind in pronouncements by policymakers and civil society activists. But on the other hand, a point that Frank has also made very clearly, the normative or institutional effects of such discursive prioritization remain rather limited. Next slide, please. The impact on ecological integrity at the planetary scale. Here, briefly, we have found that there is widespread doubt among studies that the SDGs can actually steer society towards more ecological integrity at the planetary scale. There's very little evidence that any normative and institutional change in this specific direction has actually materialized because of the SDGs. And studies on international environmental governance certainly indicate only a limited role of the SDGs in actually facilitating the clustering of international agreements by serving as some sort of collective headlines towards sustainable development. Overall, scholars argue that while the SDGs may help to highlight environmental protection as an important concern, parts of their targets are structurally incompatible with efforts to steer towards a much more ambitious program for ecological integrity that is currently urgently needed. Next slide, please. With respect to methods, we have found, of course, our point of departure is that the impact assessment shows a compounding mix of novelty, of complexity, of uncertainty, but also of urgency around the SDGs. An urgency in understanding what they have achieved, urgency also in trying to understand how one could improve on what they have not done so well. And certainly one of our main findings is that all of this calls for very novel approaches to research, to assessments, but also certainly of scientific cooperation. Also involving the Global South. So our work on methodology and epistemology identifies also several knowledge gaps and avenues to strengthen current research approaches and the type of research approaches that we would need going forward to see how we tackle the next few years up until 2030 and what comes beyond 2030. Next slide, please. You can read in far more considerable detail than we have been able to present to you here today the main findings of the study. First, in an article that has just been published in Nature Sustainability, titled "The Scientific Evidence on the Political Impacts of the SDGs." It is an open access article. It is freely available for everyone to download. Next slide, please. The broader study, the more comprehensive study, will very soon be published by Cambridge University Press, entitled "The Political Impact of the Sustainable Development Goals." And this, of course, is also an open access resource and book. And we wish also to thank, of course, the European Research Council for its generous funding that enabled this and the broader study, which we are very grateful for. You can access the book free of charge, but we also realize that there might be some who would still like to have the hard copy in their hands, so hard copies will also be on sale. We do encourage you to please engage with both the article and of the broader book, and please do not hesitate to get in contact with anyone involved within the project. Certainly the main project leaders, Frank Bierman, Thomas Hickman, and Carol Ann Sennett, if you have any feedback, suggestions, or would like to become involved with our work further. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Frank and Louis. I would now like to request all our panelists to put on their cameras, and now we can move on to the panel discussion. So we've heard some of the findings of the SDG Impact Assessment, which shows that while the rhetoric is there, the political effects of the SDGs are still limited and the goals are not yet transformative. And the first question I would like to ask our panelists, all of course except Louis and Frank, is to what extent you recognize these results in your own area of work and how you would explain this. So maybe I can start with Andrea Ordóñez for this question and then move on with the other panelists.
Thank you, Melanie, and it's great to be in this event to discuss the book that it has been, so long in the making. And I just want to highlight a little bit about the question of the national level, since that's the chapter that I was leading along with Rob Raven, and I think what we had been discussing in this chapter in particular was this glass half full, half empty that we had been seeing in terms of the implementation of the SDGs. And I think the half full glass comes partially from the Global South, because of the experience that was already there because of the MDG. So we see a lot of countries taking advantage of the existing frameworks, setups that were there in place and so on, to adopt the SDGs within these existing frameworks. I think that was, of course, in a sense, for many countries, efficient. But it posed a question, and I think that was one of the main questions that governments have been having around the implementation of the SDGs, depending on the trajectory that you were coming from and where the key aspects of the SDGs were coming through. But for many of the countries in the Global South that had been implementing the MDGs, that was a very social agenda. Then the question becomes, well, how do you really make this one more of a sustainable agenda? So how are you bringing in the aspects of economy and the aspects of the environment? So I think from my perspective, what I see is that, it's a little bit, we've taken, many countries have signed up to the idea, and they are, implementing it, but maybe with some structures that were there in the past that may not be the best fit for the current problems that we're facing and the challenges that we will have moving forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea. Maybe we can move on now to Jorge Valderrabano.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Jorge. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm representing an organization named Agora, Mexico, and also a member of the United Network of Young Peace Builders, and I'm part of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth. I would like to express my gratitude to participate in this panel. I'm happy to know that there is a space for young people to speak. I'd also like to congratulate to everyone involved in the issuance of the SDG Impact Assessment. It is a very valuable exercise to evaluate how the SDGs are being translated into reality, either at the discourse level or, as we would like, into normative and institutional changes. I like it that the analysis is based on other people's work, on a compilation of the knowledge, the policy analysis, the overall studies that have been conducted by local actors, um, organizations, research institutes that are actually the institutions that know the context, that can provide good first-hand evidence. Sometimes they can provide even better evidence than official figures themselves, right? And in many cases, um, governments are lacking these key linkages to explain human rights, climate, economic, or social related issues. I've been mostly collaborating in civil society during more than 5 years, mainly creating social interventions that are providing evidence and knowledge on what works or what doesn't work for satisfying a necessity or for addressing social issues or even simply for identifying necessities, no, at the community level. And during these years, I've been doing workshops on human rights. I've been participating in forums, publishing in scientific journals. And few of these efforts are being monitored or considered by public institutions when reporting their advances in SDGs. I have been implementing social projects, mainly aiming to provide evidence to decision makers on what works, no? So that later these initiatives can be implemented from the government side, but with more reach, more resources involved, more people, more capacity as a whole than what a civil society organization can do. But what we can do is, yes, evaluate, explain a situation, increase the knowledge on an issue, um, and this is what governments need to learn if they want to operationalize the agenda, how to go local, right? How to have an impact, how to actually fulfill the needs to meet the goals in the SDGs. And this is evidently something that they can learn from civil society actors, from the groups that are doing the work on the ground, and what the methodological tools and studies such as the impact assessment are doing is retaking this evidence, no, on the ground to evaluate if we are actually meeting the macro level standards in the SDGs. And there is a huge need to turn to look at these innovative exercises and research methods and to support them and make them part of UN procedures, no, or public procedures. And we don't need, like, where national voluntary reports are not actually representing the realities on the ground. No, they are showing statistics that sometimes are even contrary to the figures that have been published by civil society, and where we usually see shadow reports, no, as a result. So we need processes that consider the voices of people that are working at the community level, either doing research or doing interventions and creating evidence with their actions. So the impact assessment is a valuable tool that does that, and these reporting models should be adopted by governments and agencies to have a better measuring, a better way of measuring the advances of the 2030 agenda. Um, Partnering with stakeholders is key for making this happen and for better understanding the necessities. Sorry that, and yeah, just want to appreciate these kind of initiatives, and I thank your consideration and your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much. So maybe we can move to Sandra Pellegrom, who also, I think, like Andrea, has much experience with the national level.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for participating in this event and for the very interesting research. I think the questions that you're trying to answer in your research really reflect the urgency that we all feel that, you know, we have this agenda, we need to move on it. Three things reflecting on the research. First of all, the SDGs, of course, are a political agreement. It's not magic. It's, you know, the SDGs is us. So we are going to have to make those changes. And that brings me to the second point. The very nice 17 colorful little squares are very easy to understand, but sometimes people forget that this is not an easy agenda. The SDGs are really about systemic change, and they recognize that we need to have systemic change in order to achieve all of these goals. And I think that also means that, you know, it takes time to get to a point where we actually are able to move. This is not an excuse, because we need to move faster, but it is really about very fundamental issues that are difficult for all countries, I think, to tackle. And I think, as Jorge said, innovation and figuring out together, how do you do this? How do you get to behavioral change? How do you get to the type of business models that reward sustainability and inclusiveness rather than, you know, the things that we do not want to value so much? It's a process. So I do see a lot of things changing, and looking back, you know, when we're in our old people's home, I hope we can all say, wow, this actually moved pretty fast looking back. But now that we're in it, it doesn't feel fast enough, and it is not fast enough. So we do need to speed up. Finally, and I think you recognize that also in your research, in society, I see a lot of people and organizations embracing the SDGs, because what I see in the Netherlands is that so many organizations are looking, how can they contribute to the big challenges of our time, both in terms of the planetary boundaries that you mentioned, in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of increasing equal opportunities and equity in the way we, you know, prosperity is divided. People and organizations want to contribute to changing that and to improving their communities, the world. And I see that the SDGs provide a really strong, solid, inspirational framework for them and a compass, which helps people to see that they're not alone. They're all working towards these same goals. These goals are interconnected. And it is a really strong message. And it's also a strong tool because the goals are so concrete. You can really use them to see what you as an organization can contribute. So I do see a big movement in society. I do see the SDGs influencing organizations in trying to see how can they contribute. And what I also find positive is that I see that we are starting to really try and see how we can embrace this holistic nature of the SDGs. And that, of course, is a big challenge, but we start to realize and recognize that you cannot achieve one goal without the other. And how do you do this, such a holistic approach? And then to finish, I would like to make a short advertisement for our voluntary national review. As a Kingdom of the Netherlands, we've really tried in our review to look at where we are with the SDGs from this holistic perspective. And to make this manageable, what we did is we looked at 6 major systemic challenges or entry points that we are dealing with, which are also very topical for our Dutch situation. How do you get to a fair energy and climate transition? How do you increase equal opportunities and inclusiveness in your society? How do you move to a truly sustainable agriculture and food system? And in each of these transitions, we've combined 4, 5, 6 different SDGs and try to see how do you make a more integrated approach in that sense. And we've learned some interesting lessons that we also reflect in our VNR. So I hope you will all read it. But, you know, it's a process. I'm more of the glass half full in this respect, but we do need to speed up.
Yeah, so some challenges, but also some cautious optimism I hear from the Netherlands. So maybe we can now move on to the global level experts, and maybe I can give the floor to Pamela Jessic.
Greetings, everybody, and thank you for including me in this panel. I want to echo a little bit of what Sandra said because it really resonated not only at the national level, but I think at the international level, and the challenges that you have when you have such a large integrated agenda in a world built on silos. We live in a world built on ministries with different portfolios and departments within ministries built on their own portfolios, and an international system that is also built that way. And so one of the challenges that the SDGs and the whole 2030 agenda brings to the picture is, can we not only talk across these silos, but how can we better work together? And unfortunately, the system is built in such a way that there's a disincentive to working together, particularly when at the national level, different ministries are trying to get funding for implementation and don't necessarily want to share that funding. When at the UN system as well, there's a whole series of different turf battles going on, and you don't want to give away something. So the challenge is, how do you get greater cooperation in a world of, shall we say, of lack of incentive to do so? There's other ways I could say that, but I have COVID and it's early in the morning. I think just looking at a project that I just recently finished for the UN Environment Management Group, what I found very interesting in that is, the Environment Management Group was set up to get all, over 50 UN agencies and multilateral environmental agreement secretariats to work together and cooperate on the environmental part of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And a lot of the findings from this project, which involved interviewing over 30 different agency heads in the lead up to Stockholm Plus 50, was that the concerns they raised very much mirror some of the concerns that we've had with the SDGs, even though those were focused much more on how do we better integrate environment into our work, and how do we better work at the country level to ensure that environment is integrated with development. And one of the big things that came out of this project, as well as several others I've been doing with the EMG, is really at the international level. And I'm going to leave, by the way, the HLPF, I'm leaving to Marianne. That, how can the UN, the one UN system, the UN national offices work better to integrate the multilateral environmental agreements and the SDGs into their work and provide a more integrated face at the national level to enable better national implementation? Because if we're going to see change, we're going to see it at the national and local levels. At the international level, I'm not looking at the HLPF, because the HLPF is not responsible for implementation. The HLPF is a clearinghouse for reporting in and for seeing where we're at and assessing where we're at, which is sort of what this project was doing at a different level. So I could go on forever, but I know we have much more to talk about, but those are my main points.
All right, so overcoming siloed activities and working in an integrated manner. So maybe last but not least, I can give the floor to Marianne Buisheim for this question.
Thank you, Melanie, Frank, Louis, and colleagues for excellent comments and presentations. As Melanie indicated, I'm also working on global level governance and co-authored with Pam and others the chapter on global governance in the book. And my personal focus in my research is on the high-level political forum, which actually starts today here in New York. And when you are here, you wonder, how can you say that there's no substantial impact of the SDGs when everything at the moment at the United Nations seems to be about the SDGs? Everybody definitely talks about them. So there is discursive impact for sure, works on them, and the UN seems to be all about them. But of course, we have to see the larger picture, right? It's not only those 8 days, we have to look what's happening before and after. And certainly we also have to look beyond the bubble. So what happens outside of the bubble? And here the findings in the academic literature are a bit skeptical. So what we did in this chapter is we looked at the documents itself that mandate the high-level political forum and other global institutions on doing certain things. And we also looked at the expectations of experts in the early literature in terms of steering effects of the SDGs. And that was our point of reference then in our assessment, what the literature says about the actual impact so far. And the literature really expected 4 things to happen. That is, to enhance political leadership and guidance on sustainable development policies, to improve global level system-wide coherence and the coordination of global level sustainable development policies, strengthen the so-called global partnership, that is the means of implementation, and strengthen the global level follow-up and review. And while really you could say that it's impressive, also compared to the MDGs that Andrea mentioned, the general uptake is really impressive, and the UN even has an online database on UN system SDG implementation. Still, I mean, you know, the transformative impact is not really what we want to see. Take, for example, the HLPF in itself. It is an institutional effect because it's a newly created institutional home for the SDGs at the United Nations. But as Pam indicated already, at the same time, it's not like the powerhouse within the UN system that could steer the whole system and that could, you know, take care of the actual implementation of the SDGs. The ministerial declaration that it produces and is not really giving enough political leadership and guidance. It's not an action plan for the implementation of the SDGs, and it's not actually global policy making. So the normative steering effects that the book was interested in cannot be really seen coming from this process and coming from this document. At the same time, as Sandra has pointed out, the VNR process, so the steering effects on follow-up and review, are really quite impressive. The uptake of the voluntary reporting was enormous. Unexpectedly high numbers of countries want to come, they want to report. We have about 300 voluntary national reviews this year, and alone now with this HLPF, 44 countries come to report, most of them for the second time, and I believe the Netherlands also present their second review here. And reports have become much better, and the peer learning, so the sharing of good practices, as Sandra indicated, is something that really works quite well now. But at the same time, the academic literature there's not much research on the actual impacts of this kind of peer learning then again on either global level, national level, local level policy making. So this is definitely an avenue for future research. So in the end, I mean, transformative impact is really a quite high bar, right? It means that everything needs to change, as Sandra indicated. And if I look at the message from Stockholm Plus 50 earlier this year, I think there it became very clear it's not just the environmental ministers who can do this job. And this is one of the messages of the 2030 agenda. It's an all of government and all of society approach that is needed. And that's a tough task. And if I look at my own country, Germany, for example, just now having the G7 presidency, and if you look at the communique of the G7 summit, you know, the SDGs are in the document, but it's not really, you know, a guiding principle. They are not really steering the whole agenda. So the impact is really limited, and other things dominate the agenda, and we can discuss that further in the second round. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all so much for answering this first question. Of course, we gave you 2 two key questions. So the first was kind of reflecting on the impact assessment and the findings. And the second question that, of course, looking forward also to the midterm review is very important, is what we can do now. So how can we maybe increase the impact of the SDGs? I think in your first reflections, you all shared some bottlenecks that you observe here. And maybe for the forward-looking question, so what can we do to increase the political impact of the SDGs? I might start with Sandra Pellegrom, because I think she also has to leave a bit early, so we can make sure that she also can partake in this question.
Yes, thank you. I have so many thoughts, and I thank you very much to the other panelists for the very in-depth review, and that it really inspires me also. I just came from a discussion we had here with the SDG movement in the Netherlands about how do we deal with criticism against the SDG agenda, especially criticism that it doesn't go far enough, that it promotes economic growth, which I tend to doubt. And I think one of the interesting things we realized is there's not very much of an alternative if you want to change the world, and if you want to put the world on a sustainable path in the sense of respecting planetary boundaries, inclusiveness, and a fair distribution of prosperity, of well-being in particular. There is not much that we have that is better than the SDGs as a vision, as a framework. Again, then the question is, how do we implement it? And I think that is an interesting one going forward, that we dive much deeper into the how. The SDGs have a little bit of the how, but I think it's pretty instrumental the way that the means of implementation are mentioned in the SDGs. And as this is a transformative agenda and it's really about system change, the how question has to go much deeper. How do you get to these points, like I mentioned before, where you really value things differently in your economic models, where you inspire people to change their behavior, even though we know that it's really hard to give up things that you already have. It's much harder than not having things that you never had. So these are really the things I think that will help us move the agenda forward when we are prepared to dive into these issues together that hold us back. The silos that Pam mentioned, very important one. How do you overcome them? How do you get out of how do you get out of this siloed thinking and siloed working? Final thought about that. I always encourage, I always say to people, the challenge with the SDGs is that we need to move fast, but we need to move together, and we need focus, but we need to have a broad view as well to deal with all the SDGs. So all of our existing certainties, like, you can either move fast or you move together. No, we need to do both. And the other one, you can either focus on a specific goal, or you can have a whole holistic perspective and take your time to really think everything through. Yeah, we need to do both. And I think that really means that we need to shift our perspective and start doing things in a new and innovative way. I don't have the answers, but I do think that these type of discussions are going to help us forward. I do not believe, let me say that, in negotiating a completely different new other agenda. I think we have a really strong agenda here, and we would all do well to focus on getting it done and not to think about, what else might have been.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sandra. Well, maybe as you referred to the point raised by Pamela Chesik, maybe we can move on to her reflections, kind of linking to those.
Okay, thank you. I think there's a couple of things that we need to look at, because it's definitely not easy to go through systemic change, as has been said. And I think that on the one hand, what if you look at this as a data gathering exercise, not this project necessarily, but the whole SDGs, it is putting us in a position to have a much better understanding of where everybody's at. We're, using all of the data and all of the benchmarks and all of the development. I think through this process, we are going to understand the world better. And I think that's, in a sense, also a positive thing. But how do we move forward on this sort of integrated, voluntary universal agenda? And we have to remember it's voluntary. We have to remember that when the SDGs were adopted, one of the things governments were told was that you do not have to implement or make plans to address all 169 targets. You need to focus on what's most important for you. The problem is what's most important for a national government is not always what's most important for local governments or the international system. And that's going to be inherently a challenge to rectify that sort of the differences of expectations. But at the same time that, and I wrote something down and now I don't remember what it was, that, the question of economic growth and, how can we justify the SDGs against economic growth? And one thing is, should we start challenging the whole notion that growing GDP is the only way to measure success or failure? And I think that's part of this whole exercise is how can we move towards a more green economy and a more circular economy? How can we involve more actors? How can we involve the private sector and move beyond the point where ODA is the only way to fund implementation of this agenda? So looking to broaden the reach of the SDGs, to incorporate more and diverse sources of funding for implementation of various targets, helping to prioritize what is the most important things for different countries, recognizing that not all are important to everyone. My favorite, which some of you have heard before, is, if you're a landlocked country, SDG 14 is not always your top priority, although oceans and seafood and trade are all very important. If you don't have a coastline, maybe you put SDG 14 a little lower on your priority list, just because you have to pick and choose, because it's overwhelming otherwise. And I also think the last, part, which I mentioned before, is that there needs to be greater support from the international level down to the national level, and there needs to be greater cooperation among the UN implementing agencies to recognize that we're not, and this is a problem with the HLPF too, don't silo the goals and how you're looking at them. Recognizing that different programs and projects actually implement multiple goals at the same time and multiple targets at the same time. And you can get a lot more, to use an American expression, bang for your buck if you realize that this particular program or project is not just implementing SDG 14, but it's implementing 6 other SDGs and maybe 20 other targets at the same time. And I think that will really help in understanding how we are implementing these goals.
Yeah, thank you. Well, since you also mentioned the HLPF, maybe we can move to Marianne Weisheim for her reflection. Oh, I think.
All right, I'm back. Sorry for this technical glitch. Yes, indeed. And I'm myself here at the HLPF not only to participate in the meeting, but also to do interviews on exactly this kind of question, to understand better what people think, why and how governing through goals worked so far, and how to increase the speed and the transformative impact of the agenda. And so far I'm getting mainly two storylines. One is about domestic politics and polarization, and the other one, and of course the two are linked, is an increasing strain on multilateralism. And let me just tell you a little bit about my latest research that I have published last year, because in 2021, member states discussed whether they should upgrade the HLPF given its performance so far. But in the negotiations, it became pretty clear that member states couldn't really agree on how to do this and to what result. And there are various reasons. Some are linked to sustainable development issues, but one of the main reasons is that countries are very much concerned about their sovereignty, including their sovereign rights to exploit their resources and decide upon their path of development. And this impedes deeper and broader cooperation. And we still have the old debate, the seemingly pre-Rio debate on environment versus development, and that is in linked to the debate that Pam mentioned around ODA and the role of growth. Here it's the right to development, or the old conflicts around common but differentiated responsibilities. So this is all still there and very relevant. So I think what we need to do is we also, as researchers, need to focus more on these underlying unresolved political issues and conflicts, and then think about how to tackle these, whether it's at the global level or at the national level. And I think, you know, I very much agree with Sandra and Pam what you said about the integrated approach. I think we need to discuss the how question exactly, the policy packages that tackle multiple targets at the same time, not only because there are synergies, but also to overcome the trade-offs and to really, you know, gain speed. But we need to do this in a way that reflects these underlying political issues and then create incentives to overcome them. Also, and specifically in terms of means of implementation. And we need to do this both for the decade of action, definitely now, and also when thinking about post-2030, because I agree also with Sandra, we don't need to negotiate a new agenda with goals, but we need to tackle the how question, because the goals are fine, right? It's not the goals, it's the way to achieve them, and this should be our focus.
Yeah, thank you. So in answering the first question, Andrea, you mentioned the need to make sure that national institutions are also transformed to integrate this environmental dimension. Do you have any more reflections on the way forward to share as on this topic as well?
Thank you, Melanie. So I think that to build up on some of the discussion that has been going on in the panel, I just want to reiterate this need of not to focus so much on the goals themselves, but on the process. And I think that may be something that you know, we may also want to think about how we are conveying for the findings of the book itself, because I think at the end all the group of scientists were coming together to identify these bottlenecks more so than saying that you know, we want a different set of goals themselves, also because we do have to value the fact that these ones, although imperfect, were reached that through a somewhat more debated process and through you know, discussions within the UN system with member states all agreeing to this. And it's easy to criticize them and easy to forget that maybe if we were to do that today, we wouldn't have any goals. So it's important to also, you know, guard and protect some of the progress. And I think that for me, and you know, with the lessons from COVID and the response from COVID and so on, this question of really what does it mean that the agenda is universal? And like Pam was saying, I don't think this means that everybody's doing everything at the same time. But then what does it mean that the agenda is universal? And I think here there is space for a lot of you know, countries to be thinking of their own actions and the implications that they have for other countries, you know, their own national activities and the implications for what happens because of those to other countries. So, for example, indeed, the natural resources are a key question here, and we know that where the demand is coming from is not where the minerals and other natural resources are being extracted, right? And we also know that there are different reasons of why we have the food system value chains that we have right now that are not working, right? So how are we thinking through some of these systems that are universal and what each one of the parts can be doing in that respect? I think that's a bit of the challenge moving forward. And in terms of the lessons from COVID and the fiscal response, you know, the multilateral response with the special drawing rights and so on, I think it's also important to remember that you know, governments have the capacity to create some more fiscal space for these solutions. So I think that this question of where are we coming up with the money for all of these, we should drop that question altogether and say, you know, governments, you know how to create some of the public funding to respond to this. Let's just start deciding how to do it, and you know how those funds are distributed among countries. We know that the mechanisms that we have so far for special drawing rights in the IMF and so on are not going to respond to the needs that we have. So really, it's not about the money. Again, coming back to the question of the GDP, we've seen it with COVID. There can be an agreement of creating more public money, which is the most critical one that we need. We should, I think, as you know, actors from the non-public space, be advocating for that, making sure that we're saying we know that more public funding can be created for these. So let's get on with it.
Thank you so much. So maybe now I can give the floor to Frank Bierman.
Thank you so much. I mean, thanks all for the comments. That's very, very, very important and very interesting. I think one point is just there is social. I mean, one point just to pick up on one point of Sandra, to renegotiate the goals. I think these goals are very important and they're generally fine. I think we should not need to have a discussion about a new goal, and I intend also to define these goals against all other attempts that are sometimes in the literature of setting like science-based targets and all kind of science-driven goal-setting processes. The charm or the importance of the SDGs is they come from societies and governments. They are publicly agreed from governments, parliaments to some extent by delegation, and civil society. I think it's very important. So we don't need to have parallel processes of setting goals by other actors. I think that's very important. On the other hand, I think we are afraid to some extent also of a certain demobilization effect of the SDGs. That means that there is this discursive effect that we have realized that is clear. It's also supported by all the panelists, that everybody talks about the SDGs in the field. There's a lot of debate. There are on all kind of posters and flyers, and in the Netherlands, there used to be actually a car also painted with the SDGs at one point. Anyway, so the point is, does it take away energy? Does it take away mobilization from societal actors? Does it give the impression that there is action where there is actually no action. So therefore, SDGs can also have a negative impact by taking away energy from societal actors and from societal movements. And we have to be maybe also very concerned and critical about that particular aspect. And then in the way forward, I mean, the how question is very important, has been mentioned by all panelists. Our project, the Global Goals project, will continue in this direction. So we are really trying to understand also better what can be done. And there is, of course, a lot of political science research already now available that argues what makes international institutions powerful, what makes them impactful. And the elements such as that institutions are more powerful, the more precise their targets and their goals are, the higher degree of delegation is, and the higher degree of obligation is. So one could think about, it doesn't mean that the SDGs have to be legally binding per se, that would be the one extreme, but to move in the direction of having more precision, terms of more quantitative targets under the SDGs, to have a higher degree of delegation, that would mean strengthening the higher political forum, for example, and a higher degree of obligation. I think these are three different directions in which the SDGs can move forward and become more powerful in the next 7 years. And then maybe also new steps can be taken for the period after 2030. I think that's kind of an important part. And we as the Global Goals Project want to move in this direction to help also analyze and supporting these kind of activities. And the final point is, I agree with Sandra very much that the point of togetherness. On the other hand, I mean, the question is, does everything really have to be together? Can it be also possible, like in climate, we're discussing the climate clubs. I mean, that's one important part of the climate agenda where people talk about, let's not do everything together with 193 countries, have smaller clubs moving forward. Is it maybe not also a case for having SDG clubs, for moving with certain SDGs forward, not necessarily with everybody, but with smaller coalitions of countries in North and South that are more committed, that are more interested, that are more devoted to the SDGs. That could be also a way forward for certain of the SDGs that are especially lagging behind, and could be also a way forward for those who are from the ministries and pushing this forward to develop SDG clubs. And I leave over to the colleagues. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe also, Louis, last but not least, some of your reflections.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, I want to pick up on one point that Pam Chasik has made. And I would certainly support the proposal that we need to rethink going forward, both in ending the next phase of the SDGs, but certainly also what comes after the SDGs, to rethink the structural foundations upon which society builds its visions of growth and developmentalism, for example. What do we see as growth? What do we see as developmentalism? Are these all necessarily good things? Are there alternatives available? Getting governments and society broadly, of course, to agree on all these alternatives is a very different matter. Many people would be aware of the important work that Jason Hickel, for example, is doing in degrowth. Perhaps this is a way forward. Do we necessarily need to measure growth and development in terms of GDP? Aren't there other metrics available to measure well-being and so forth? And personally, and some of my research has focused on this, is that I think one of the starting erroneous premises of the SDGs is the fact that they are built on the principle of sustainable development, a principle that was certainly initially very well meant when it was designed. But it has become co-opted by a very capitalist neoliberal mindset that also leads to destructive policies of extractivism and global injustice, certainly for those countries in the global south. So whatever instruments, I think, or approach that we choose to go forward, I think sustainable development as such cannot be part of that specific instrument. And we need to be critical of this. So sustainable development has served its purpose, I think, but it has become outdated, both in the context of the serious planetary crisis that we are facing and the extent of global injustices that we are seeing across the world. And there's a lot of critical scholarship on sustainable development. And I think we need to face the reality of the destructive effects of this principle. And the big challenge, of course, is to come up with an alternative that would be more embracive of the entire living order in a just, equal, and fair way, while respecting planetary integrity, and something that all stakeholders, including all states and people in the global north and the global south, can support and sign on to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for your reflections here. So I guess there are quite some different views on potential ways forward. We have a couple of minutes left. We do not have a lot of time, but I think one question from the audience that maybe you could reflect on, and I hope someone will feel inclined to respond to this, is to what extent the lack of a transformative impact of the SDGs can also be connected to a low public awareness of them. I think Sandra Pelgrom already reflected on the complexity of the agenda a bit. Is this something we can take on board, work on? Who can I give the word on this topic? Maybe Pam?
Could you repeat the final part that you just said? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so to what extent do you think a lack of public awareness might be one of the reasons for the limited transformative potential, and to what extent can we also improve public awareness?
Well, one thing with, with public awareness, I remember when the goals were adopted in September 2015, there was a lot of attempts to raise public awareness and to get, whether it's entertainers and musicians and movie stars and companies and everything else, to really get on board. And you saw the SDG icons everywhere, and there was all different competitions for youth and sports teams and everything to use the SDGs. And that's sort of, went down as, following the launch, as these things tend to do, as we move on to the next thing in this very low attention span environment that we all live in. And I think, going forward, we need more of that level of public awareness, but we also need to teach it more. And we need to teach it in schools. We need to find better ways to make it more concrete to students. This is something I've been trying to do at the university level, where we're taking several SDGs and how do we implement those targets on campus, and putting together proposals and presenting them to the administration and actually getting some change. And so, but also, how can this be done, at elementary school levels in a way that's understandable, and in a way that's elementary school students and secondary school students can do projects that are implementing a small part of the agenda, which makes them feel part of the larger agenda. And I know in a lot of school systems, it's very challenging to get anything other than the basics into the curriculum, but I think it can be brought in that way. And I think that perhaps needs to be more investment in teaching the SDGs, especially to young children, and primary, secondary school, and even university level students, in a way to implement them, not just what they are, not just how they're governed, but how can we actually do things on the ground to help implement them. That would be my suggestion.
I saw Louis nodding to this reaction. Do you want to add anything to this question?
Not anything specifically. I think that I mean, I've got no scientific evidence for this, but my perception at least is that the SDGs are well known. It is, for example, much more known in broader society, the circles that I move in, at least, my mother and my father, for example, than the Convention on Biological Diversity, for example. So people know about this, and I think that that is not necessarily the problem. The problem is lack of lack of deep structural change that we can achieve through this, and getting society involved to act upon more deliberately based on the goals in tandem with governments. So perhaps one also needs to change the one perception, and that is that achievement of the SDGs is not only the purpose of governments, it is everyone's objective. It should be everyone's task. That is what I would say to this.
Yeah, so we only have a few minutes left in this panel, and I'm sure everyone is very eager also to move to the opening. So maybe I can ask Marianne, Frank, and Andrea to just share a final reflection that they might want to add based on this discussion moving forward. So maybe I can start with Andrea here.
I think it's been a rich discussion, and it just shows that, you know, it's more about the action than the actual goals, and I think that's what we have to keep in mind during the next week and a half or so on, where we're monitoring the HLPF. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. Then I will move on to Marianne in this case.
Okay, thank you, Melanie. I hope you can hear me fine because my earphones gave up. Let me discuss Rob Wheeler's point in the chat. I totally agree. We need to keep pushing. Of course, we are scientists and less so activists, but you know, if you ask me what I would like to see coming out of OCA, I mean, our common agenda, the report of the Secretary General, has 90 plus suggestions how to improve the global governance system, and many of them are really excellent suggestions. But of course, the current political situation, as you are all aware, is super difficult, and it won't be easy. But nevertheless, I agree, Rob, we need to keep pushing. But the most urgent thing I would like to see happen is a meaningful interplay next year with the planned summit of the future and the SDG summit, which, you know, so far planned, are both happening in September 2023, when the General Assembly opens. And so far, I don't see much planning for interlinking the two summits in a meaningful way. And I'm very happy that actually the HLPF will discuss this question in a session this week. I believe it's Thursday afternoon, discussing how to make the best out of this high-level SDG summit at the level of heads and state and government, because this is really then the halfway through midterm review that is supposed to happen, and this is really where the political leadership and guidance needs to be seen, and a meaningful interplay with the summit of the future would indeed be helpful. And you know, if this happens, I would be already happy. Thank you.
Yeah, last but not least, Frank, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I mean, this is difficult to follow up on Marianne. I fully agree with what has been said. I think from our research perspective, so I think our findings are pretty solid. I can also say that the Global Goals project, a research project we run here at Utrecht, comes to similar conclusions in many ways, that the SDGs have this discursive effect, but not necessarily being a major transformative factor. So I think for the research community, it's very important to move onwards and to study this how question. This is a bit on the lines of what many have said here. And I think one thing that I think is important is to better understand the tension with universality, that everything, like what Sandra said, everything should be there, everybody should be there, but also add ideas about SDG clubs. I mean, to have a smaller community of states that are moving forward in certain directions on certain SDGs, and to pick certain targets, certain SDGs, and move forward in very dedicated fashion among certain countries, certain civil society actors. I think this could be one way forward to really pick certain SDGs. And I think the ones that where the institutionalization is the weakest is SDG 10, 12, and 16. I think these are also the more recent ideas in a sense. I think would be very important to move in particular on these three, and also the others, of course, move forward and not necessarily do this in a collective effort with 193 countries. So there's always a way also for smaller community or countries to move forward. And this could be one part of the how. And we will definitely, in our community, continue this discussion. So I'm looking forward also in this network of scientists that we have found in this assessment, 61, more of them are maybe joining, that we continue also our collaboration. We have now done this, one publication is out, the SDG assessment has been published. It can be downloaded in a few weeks from the Cambridge site. The entire assessment with more than 100,000 words can be downloaded. But we will continue our effort, continue working together. And I'm very grateful for your cooperation. I'm grateful for your participation here. And for those who are in New York, I wish you all the best today with the important deliberations that you are observing. And please keep us informed on Twitter and all other events. And I want to thank in particular also Melanie for guiding us through this discussion, and for Blake, who is in the background also there and helps us with the technical part. Thanks a lot for Melanie and Blake in particular, and for the entire audience also, and for all your comments. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and with those words, I think I also want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion today. Hopefully, we will continue discussing these topics, and I hope everyone will have a great contribution and participation in this high-level political forum. Thank you so much.